Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Let's proceed. After seeing what is indirect rule, how was good in Africa, now let's choose one case study. Our case study is Tanganyika. So let's see how British used the indirect rule system in Tanganyika. The indirect rule system in Tanganyika. Tanganyika formerly was German colony from 1886 after Berlin Conference. After the end of the First World War of 1814 to 1918, Germany lost Tanganyika colony to British, who took the victory of the war. I mean that former Tanganyika was German colony, but after the Berlin Conference, Germany was termed as the main causative of the World War I. Therefore, all African colonies were taken from Germany. Then Tanganyika was under the British. So during German rule in Tanganyika, they used the direct rule, thus faced a lot of resistance from Tanganyika societies such as Hehe resistance, Yao resistance, and Chaga resistance. I mean, during the German rule, Tanganyika was under direct rule. As I said, that German preferred to use the direct rule. During the Germans' rule, they faced a lot of resistances. Example is Hehe resistance, Yao resistance in southern Tanganyika, and Chaga resistance. Therefore, after the British took control over Tanganyika colony, they decided to change the former German direct rule, which used the Jumbes and Akidas, and introduced the indirect rule. Therefore, British, after recognizing that during the German rule, since German rule experienced the intensive resistance which caused due to their ruling system, which was the direct rule. Therefore, the British decided to change the ruling system from direct rule to indirect rule. Now, the first British governor in Tanganyika was known as Sir Donald Cameron, initiated that the introduction of indirect rule in Tanganyika. Sir Donald initiated and introduced the indirect rule in Tanganyika. So the governor Donald Cameron decided to introduce the indirect rule in Tanganyika as her colony. Sir Donald Cameron decided to introduce indirect rule in Tanganyika due to the influence and motivation from Governor Lord Frederick Lugard, who succeeded to control Nigeria through indirect rule. As we know that Nigeria also was under the British control, which was under the Sir Governor Lord Frederick Lugard, who used the also indirect rule and get succeed. Therefore, he influenced the Sir Donald Cameron to use indirect rule in Tanganyika too. Now, let's see, they didn't all succeed. There is no success without challenge. Let's see the challenges or difficulties in which Sir Donald Cameron faced when he introduced the indirect rule in Tanganyika. The first one is absence of traditional administrative system. Germany removed all local rulers. As we know that during the German system, local rulers were not involved in the governing. Therefore, when British came into power, he faced the difficulty where he lacked the traditional administrative rulers. German removed all local rulers in administration during their rule in Tanganyika. So it was difficult for Sir Donald Cameron to introduce them again. You can see how it was difficult. The next one is illiteracy and ignorance of masses over the indirect rule. Tanganyika was controlled and ruled by the German power for a very long time, direct rule. So indirect rule was new system which was not known. Before Tanganyika society, they were under direct rule. So after the coming of indirect rule, they didn't understand what is this. So it was in one way or another a challenge, difficult for them to succeed the indirect rule. The next one is poor organization of permanent chiefs. Few tribes in Tanganyika recognized the chief, and they had status and power, less executive, financial, and judicial. For example, Chaga. Not all society in Tanganyika had the organizable, known the ruling system. There are just a few tribes which were aware with the ruling system. So it also this acted as a difficult, because British wanted to use the local rulers. How about the societies which had no local rulers? That was very difficult, very confusion to British governors. The next one is poor infrastructure. Indirect rule got a lot of challenge in Tanganyika since the country was big, while there was poor network and communication link to reach and coordinate the local chiefs. The poor infrastructure, as we can know before the independence, how Tanganyika was. As we know, Tanganyika was big, while if there is poor network or communication, the communication also will be poor. So even to succeed what they were meant, what made them to come here, it will be difficult. So this will make it as another challenge. The next one is absence of local authorities in Tanganyika. In Tanganyika society, such as coastal tribes, which had no traditional local authorities since Arabs' domination, which introduced the Islamic law. Around the coastal areas of Tanganyika had no local chiefs compared to other tribes. For example, when you go to Nyamwezi, you can see there are chiefs. In Chaga tribe, their own chiefs. In Hehe, they had their own chiefs. But when we come to the coastal tribes areas, here we can talk about Makonde tribes. In southern part had no chiefs, so it was difficult for them to succeed. What made them to come? I mean, economic purpose. After seeing the challenges of indirect rule in Tanganyika, now let's see the effect or impact of indirect rule to Tanganyika and the British African colonies. After seeing the challenges, now let's see the impact or effect of indirect rule to Tanganyika and the British African colonies. They are general. First, exploitation of African resources. Indirect rule was introduced by the British for the purpose of exploiting African resources easily through local rulers support such as land, labor, and minerals. Therefore, through indirect rule, British British governments or colonialists succeeded to exploit Africans and their resources because they used our own local rulers. The example of those resources which they succeeded to exploit was land, labors, and minerals. The next one, indirect rule promoted or boosted tribalism. Indirect rule separated African societies in ethnic or tribal identities, since it favored some tribes, including those whose local rulers were given different opportunities than other tribes. As we know that British rule used the local rulers to support them. Therefore, the tribes in which British rule got the local rulers who helped them to rule got some opportunities and then ended up on the tribalism. And those who got some opportunity felt themselves as superior compared to those who had no chief, no kings to represent them, especially the coastal tribe areas. Another is indirect rule weakened the traditional administration system, as traditional rulers were given the local or the lower part of ruling system, where at the upper or at the top was under the British ruling system. The next one, indirect rule system promoted the problem of education, health, and employment opportunities. The next one is indirect rule system introduced the end-wind social differences among natives. Creation of classes in the society. The system commented and decentralized the bureaucrats through the use of district commissioners. As I said before, they influenced or came up with the social differences. How social differences? In terms of education, only the sons and daughters of local rulers were allowed to have education or to get education. All kings or local rulers were given the house. This created the differences between the rulers and the majority. Another is the greatest fault in indirect rule was that they completely excluded from the local government the African educated elites, whose number increased over years. Another one is it made Africans hate their local rulers or leaders who were used during the indirect rule and made Africans not to believe in them. Since indirect rule used their former or their local leaders, this made Africans to hate their leaders because they were not faithful. They were working on behalf of the whites. So this made Africans not to believe on them. Now, my dear students, after seeing the indirect rule and case study, what that was the challenge, What was the impact? Features of indirect rule. Now let's jump direct to the direct rule. Direct rule administrative system. As let's see, direct rule was a form of colonial administrative system which did not involve the African ruler to support. It was a form of colonial administrative system which did not involve, here we can see that the local rulers were not totally included in the ruling system. This was done by the German in her colonies. German preferred much to use direct rule in most of her colonies in Africa, such as Tanganyika, Namibia, Cameroon, Togo, and etc. Direct rule were also applied by Belgium, Portugal, and etc. in their colonies. Also, direct rule practiced by British in Zimbabwe. That is another case study. Now let's see the characteristics of direct rule. Features or characteristics of direct rule. First one is local chiefs were not given chance in colonial administration. Here we can see local chiefs, local leaders were not given any chance of administration. That means whites governed by themselves. The next one, it was very expensive since it needed a lot of costs. Yeah, it was very expensive since whites were needed to go direct to the farm, to the productive areas. The next one, it faced many resistance from Africans since it was very rude to the majority. Direct rule experienced the resistance. You can see there was Yao resistance in southern Tanganyika, Hehe resistance, and Jaga resistance. Since it was very rude, used the coercive apparatus like police and something like that. Another is it was not simple to control because German ruled Africa directly. It was not simple to control, very difficult because African met with German direct, unlike to the indirect rule where African met with their local chiefs, then received the order from their local chiefs. Therefore, they assumed that this order is from my own leader. Unlike to this one, where African knew that this is very oppressive, this is exploitation, he is not my leader. So they experienced it very difficult for them to succeed. Another is it faced the communication problems because of the language barrier. Africans or German used their own language, be it English or German language, Germanish, compared to African who used their ethnic languages. So it was very difficult in communication. The next one, it faced the problems of manpower since Germans were few in number. They were few in number, but they wanted to rule from the top up to the bottom. So this one acted as a characteristics of. Now let's see what were the similarities and differences between indirect rule and direct rule. These were a form of ruling introduced by the whites during the colonial era. So let's see what they are similar, what they resemble. For example, first similarity is both were based on exploitation of African resources. The the main goal of this is to ensure the exploitation of African resources, no matter it will be direct or indirect. So here you can see that these both German and the British based on exploitation of what? African resource. That is similarity. The next similarity is both based on oppression of African through the use of force, that like police, army, and court. During the British introduced the force, they used the force as they were introduced the police, prisons, army, and court. Also during the German period. The next is both based on racial segregation. Both based on racial segregation, since African color were regarded as inferior over white color. The next one is both were capitalistic system. Be it German or British, they were capitalists. And they started to come here and they're looking for colonies due to the development of capitalism. So they are both the capitalistic system. The next is both aimed at colonizing and control Africa. Their main goal, all of them, was to colonize and to control Africa. That is colonialism. The next one is both faced the resistance and opposition from Africa. Not all Africans wanted or were ready to be colonized by Europeans. That's why they experienced some resistance. The next one, both failed to meet their demand. They didn't succeed in 100%. They failed to meet their demand. Now let's see the differences. When we come to the differences, we can see direct rule was used by Germany while indirect rule used by the British. The difference here is the colonial power, the nature of the colonialist, I can say. As you can see here, the direct rule was under the German while indirect rule was under British. The next one is direct rule did not use local chiefs, while indirect used the local chiefs. As I said before, indirect rule used the local chiefs to support them, while direct rule didn't use. The next is indirect rule did not face many resistance from Africans, while direct rule faced many resistance. This is because this indirect rule was not too harsh compared to direct rule. So it was easier for the indirect rule to succeed compared to direct rule. Another is indirect rule was easy to manage, while direct rule was difficult to manage because of language problem. As we can see that in direct rule, Europeans went directly to the societies, to the majorities to rule, while they used different language. While in the side of indirect rule, the European used the local chiefs to talk with their people. So they got the language problem in the side of direct rule. Another is the indirect rule needed small Europeans manpower, while direct rule needed large number of manpower. Since in indirect rule, at the lower parts, we meet with headmen, with all chiefs, African chiefs. But in the direct rule system, there are no use of headmen or local chiefs. So we meet with the Jumbe and the Akida. So this costed much to Germans, since he needed to have a lot of manpower. The next one, very easy point, is indirect rule was cheap, but direct rule was expensive. Another is direct rule created puppet class. Indirect rule created puppet class among Europeans who cooperated with the British and support. Since British used our local rulers to help them, our rulers acted as puppets who cooperated with British and supported them in their ruling system. The next one is British colonialism, while direct rule did not. British succeeded the colonialism, while indirect rule, no. After seeing the indirect rule and direct rule, now let's see another way, another type, another form of ruling system. What is assimilation and association police? Though they are police, but we term them also as the ruling system. By introduction, we can say that French in her colonies such as Cape Verde, Ivory Coast, Senegal, and St. Louis applied two administrative systems such as assimilation police and association. These ways used a special assimilation used by French in her colonies, whereby association police was an administrative system applied by French in her colonies, which aimed at turning or transforming Africans into the Frenchmen or citizen. Police aimed to change the African totally into French citizen. A person who assimilated was called the assimilated. I mean, the African started to adopt or to behave like French in terms of living system, in every wearing system, in even eating system, the system of worship. So African turned or behaved totally like French, and they were counted as French citizens. Though they were living in Africa, but they counted as the French citizen. And those who succeeded to be assimilated were known as assimilado. Assimilado was taught how to behave or to think like French people. They are taught to behave, I mean how to wear, how to eat, how to walk, the total lifestyle like French people. Assimilation is a term derived from the French word assimiler, means cause to resemble, to look similar, to look like. French introduced the. Now it's a quiz time. I want you to give the differences between direct rule and indirect rule. Bye bye. Thank you for watching.